I buried my face into the cashmere overcoat hanging in the shadows of Mr. Hale's private closet, pressing the luxurious fabric against my mouth to stifle the sobs that kept tearing through my chest like jagged glass, my whole body trembling with the kind of fear that makes your bones feel hollow and useless, when suddenly the door flew open and pale moonlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows spilled across me like an accusation, exposing every pathetic, broken piece of me I'd been trying to hide. Standing in the doorway, his imposing frame blocking out the rest of his corner office with its view of the glittering city skyline far below, was Peter Hale himself, the Alpha King of the most powerful shapeshifter clan in North America, the man whose morning briefings I conducted with military precision at exactly 6 a.m. every day. The predator whose mere presence in a boardroom could make Fortune 500 executives break into nervous sweats without ever understanding why their instincts screamed at them to submit. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from running his hands through it, his tailored charcoal suit jacket unbuttoned, and those impossibly intense dark eyes that I'd seen flash crimson during particularly tense negotiations were now locked onto me, with a focus that made me feel like prey caught in a spotlight. His entire body going utterly still in that supernatural way that always reminded me he was something far more dangerous than human. For 10 months, I had been the picture of unshakable professionalism, the secretary who never faltered, who managed his impossible schedule coordinating both his legitimate corporate empire and the hidden supernatural kingdom he ruled with absolute authority, who never let my hands shake when dangerous rival shifters came to his office for tense territorial discussions, who kept immaculate records of meetings that often ended with barely concealed threats of violence, who organized his chaotic dual existence with such meticulous efficiency that he once told me I was the only person he'd ever met who could anticipate his needs before he voiced them. I had been so impossibly careful, maintaining appropriate distance even when our fingers accidentally brushed during document exchanges and electricity shot up my arm, bearing my completely inappropriate obsession with my powerful, lethal boss so deep beneath layers of perfectly pressed blouses and neutral expressions that I convinced myself I'd suffocated it entirely, never allowing myself to acknowledge the way my heart raced when he leaned over my desk to review reports, his scent of cedar, and something wild making my thoughts scatter like frightened birds. But tonight, everything had shattered like tempered glass under too much pressure, and the one person in the entire world I needed to keep my breakdown hidden from was now staring at me with an expression I'd never seen on his typically controlled, unreadable face, something raw and primal flickering across those aristocratic features that looked like they'd been carved from marble by an artist who understood both beauty and menace. The air in the closet suddenly felt charged with electricity, crackling with a tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in instinctive response to the predator who had just discovered wounded prey in his territory. "Olivia," he said, and my name in his deep, commanding voice that usually issued orders about corporate acquisitions and territorial boundaries with equal cool precision now carried an edge of something dark and possessive that made my already erratic heartbeat stumble and trip over itself, because underneath that single word was a growl that didn't sound entirely human, a vibration that resonated in my chest and made every cell in my body hyper-aware of exactly how dangerous the man standing before me truly was. He stepped into the closet, and the space that had felt like a refuge suddenly became suffocatingly intimate, his broad shoulders and tall, powerful frame filling every inch of available area, making it impossible to breathe anything but his scent, impossible to focus on anything but the leashed power radiating from him in waves that made my skin prickle with awareness. I watched through my tears as his eyes began to glow with that eerie crimson light that signaled his alpha nature rising to the surface, his carefully maintained human facade cracking to reveal the apex predator underneath, and then his large hand reached out, calloused fingers that had signed billion-dollar deals and probably done far more violent things, gripping my chin with surprising gentleness, tilting my face up with inexorable strength until I had no choice but to meet those burning red eyes that seemed to see every secret I'd ever kept from him, every forbidden feeling I'd locked away in the darkest corners of my heart. "Who?" he said quietly, his voice dropping to a lethal softness that I'd heard him use exactly twice before, both times right before he'd completely destroyed the careers and lives of men who dared to challenge his authority, each word precise and controlled, even as his eyes blazed with barely contained fury that made the air around us feel scorching hot. "Made you cry, Olivia? And how slowly would you like me to tear them apart?" Peter pulled me out of the closet with gentle insistence that somehow felt more commanding than any force could have been, his hands warm and solid on my arms as he guided me to the leather sofa that faced his massive desk, and I couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop the words from tumbling out between gasping breaths about Caleb Rourke, the brutal shaper who'd cornered me outside my apartment 3 nights ago with photographs of my little sister Emma leaving her college dorm, with detailed knowledge of her schedule and her roommate's name and the route she took to her morning classes. Peter's entire body went rigid beside me as I explained through tears how Caleb wanted access to Peter's proprietary algorithms that tracked shifter populations and territorial movements, information that would let him destabilize the fragile peace Peter had spent decades building. How Caleb had given me 72 hours to steal the encrypted files or watch my sister become collateral damage in a war she didn't even know existed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as I spoke, and when I finally forced myself to look at Peter's face, his eyes were blazing pure crimson, no trace of brown remaining, his features sharper and more predatory than I'd ever seen them, and for a moment I remembered, with crystalline clarity, that the man sitting beside me wasn't human at all, that beneath the expensive suits and corporate polish lived something ancient and deadly that had clawed its way to the top of the shifter hierarchy. Through strength and ruthless intelligence. His hand found mine, engulfing it completely, and the contact sent heat racing up my arm despite the fear coiling in my stomach like ice water, his thumb brushing across my knuckles in a gesture that somehow felt like a brand, like a claim being staked on territory he decided belonged to him. "Listen to me very carefully, Olivia," Peter said, and his voice had dropped into a register that vibrated through my bones, the alpha command that made every instinct I didn't know I possessed want to bare my throat in submission, want to trust that this predator would protect rather than destroy. "You and your problems are mine now. Mine to handle, mine to protect, and Caleb Rourke just made the fatal mistake of threatening something I consider under my protection." He stood in one fluid movement, pulling me up with him, his other hand cupping my face with a possessiveness that should have frightened me, but instead made something warm unfurl in my chest, and I watched as he pulled out his phone and issued rapid-fire commands about securing my sister, about moving her to a safe house, about mobilizing his security team, all while his thumb continued its hypnotic stroking across my cheekbone like he couldn't bear to stop touching me. "You're coming to my penthouse tonight," he said, and it wasn't a request, wasn't even really a suggestion, just a statement of fact delivered in that commanding tone that made it clear he expected absolute obedience. "Every second you spend anywhere Caleb can reach you is a second I'll spend imagining all the ways I'm going to destroy him for making you cry in my closet." Peter's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of his downtown high-rise, all floor-to-ceiling windows and sleek modern furniture that somehow still managed to feel dangerous, like even his living space understood it belonged to a predator, and I watched from the enormous leather sectional as he paced before those windows with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice dropping into that alpha register as he coordinated his network of shifters across 3 states, tracking Caleb's movements. Through contacts I'd never known existed despite managing every aspect of his visible life. Emma was already secure in a safe house upstate with 2 of his most trusted enforcers, Women who'd apparently torn apart a rival pack last year for encroaching on Peter's territory, and the relief that flooded through me at knowing my sister was protected made my hands finally stop shaking after hours of constant trembling. But as I watched Peter command his hidden empire with the same ruthless efficiency he brought to boardrooms, issuing orders about surveillance and tactical positioning and acceptable levels of collateral damage, I saw something flicker across his face when he glanced at me, something almost like pain, like the realization of a problem he couldn't solve with violence or strategy, or the sheer force of his dominance. He ended the call and stood silhouetted against the city lights, his broad shoulders tense, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, almost contemplative in a way that seemed foreign to a man who usually communicated in absolutes. "You understand what you've become, don't you?" he asked, turning to face me with those dark eyes that had finally faded back from crimson, but still held that predatory intensity that made my breath catch. "For 10 months, you've been the one thing in my organization that ran perfectly, the single piece of my empire I never had to worry about, and now you're the most vulnerable point in my entire operation, the liability that every enemy I've made in the last 20 years will eventually try to exploit." The words should have stung, should have made me feel like a burden, but the way he was looking at me, like I was something precious and terrifying all at once, told me this was his internal struggle, not an accusation. He moved across the room with that liquid grace that reminded me he was built for hunting, sinking onto the couch beside me close enough that his thigh pressed against mine through the fabric of his dress pants, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body like a furnace. "The logical thing," he continued, his hand finding my face again, tilting it toward him with that same possessive gentleness that was becoming dangerously addictive, would be to distance myself, to move you somewhere far away where you can't be used against me, to sever the connection before it becomes a weapon in someone else's hands. "But you won't," I whispered, and I wasn't sure if it was a question or a statement. Wasn't sure if I was reading the fierce possessiveness in his expression correctly, or just seeing what I desperately wanted to see. "No," he confirmed, his thumb brushing across my lower lip in a caress that made heat pool low in my stomach despite everything, despite the danger and the fear and the complete upheaval of my carefully ordered life. "I won't, because apparently even an Alpha King can be ruled by something stronger than logic." He stood, pulling me with him toward the hallway. "You'll sleep in the guest room tonight, and I'll be in the room directly across from yours, close enough to reach you in seconds if anything threatens you, because the idea of you being anywhere I can immediately protect you makes my alpha instincts claw at my insides like caged animals." The neutral meeting ground was an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district that apparently served as Switzerland for shifter territorial disputes, all concrete and exposed steel beams and the lingering scent of violence from previous confrontations, and I stood slightly behind Peter as Caleb Rourke emerged from the shadows on the opposite side of the vast empty space, flanked by 3 other shapers whose eyes gleamed with that predatory hunger that made my survival instincts scream at me to run. Caleb was smaller than Peter, but moved with a twitchy, unpredictable energy that reminded me of a rabid animal, all coiled violence and barely contained madness, his scarred face twisting into a smile that held no warmth, only cruel anticipation as his gaze raked over me like I was meat he was already imagining tearing into. "Alpha King," Caleb said, the title dripping with mockery as he spread his arms wide in a gesture of false welcome. "So good of you to accept my invitation, though I notice you brought your pretty little human secretary with you, which saves me the trouble of having to collect her separately." Peter's hand tightened on my arm, a silent command to stay perfectly still, and I could feel the tension radiating from him in waves, could sense his alpha nature straining against the tight control he was maintaining through sheer force of will. "State your terms," Peter said, his voice flat and dangerous, and I recognized that tone from boardroom negotiations where he dismantled hostile takeover attempts with surgical precision. except now there was an undercurrent of violence that made the air feel electric with the promise of bloodshed. Caleb's smile widened, revealing too many teeth, and he began circling slowly, his movement deliberately predatory as he spoke. Simple, really. You give me full access to your territorial tracking systems, your population databases, your sweet little algorithms that predict shifter movements across the continent, everything that makes your empire so beautifully efficient. And in exchange, I don't rip your secretary's sister into pieces small enough to mail back to you. He paused, his eyes landing on me again with an intensity that made my skin crawl. But here's the thing, Hale. I've been thinking about compensation for the years you've held dominance over territories that should have been open for competition, and I've decided that your corporate secrets aren't quite enough. He gestured toward me with one clawed hand that was already beginning to shift. I want her too. Want to know what it is about this fragile human that makes the untouchable Alpha King keep her so close. Want to break her apart slowly while you watch and understand that your protection means nothing against someone willing to challenge your authority. The change in Peter was instantaneous and terrifying, his eyes blazing crimson so bright they seemed to illuminate the entire warehouse, his body expanding slightly as his alpha nature surged to the surface, no longer contained by human civility or strategic patience, and the growl that tore from his throat was purely animal, a sound of such primal rage that even Caleb's enforcers took an involuntary step backward. You just made your last mistake, Rourke, Peter said, and his voice had dropped into a register that resonated with alpha command, with absolute authority that made every shifter instinct in the room respond with the urge to submit. I challenge you to formal combat, public witness, with your life as the stakes, because you threatened what's mine, and there's no walking away from that. The private training facility beneath Peter's building was something I'd never known existed despite coordinating every aspect of his schedule, all reinforced concrete walls and specialized equipment designed to withstand shifter strength. And for 3 days I watched from the observation gallery as Peter pushed his body to limits that defied everything I understood about human physiology, his muscles rippling as he tore through practice dummies with claws that extended from his hands mid-strike, his speed so impossible that sometimes I lost track of his movement entirely and could only follow the destruction he left in his wake. He trained with a massive shifter named Marcus, who'd apparently served as his enforcer for 15 years, and I witnessed Peter take blows that should have shattered bones only to recover in seconds, watched him shift partially between forms with a control that suggested decades of mastering the violence that lived beneath his human skin, and every time his crimson eyes found me watching from above the observation glass, something possessive and fierce would flash across his features that made my heart race with equal parts fear and something dangerously close to desire. On the third night, I found him in the penthouse gym, his torso bare and gleaming with sweat, dark bruises already fading across his ribs from where Marcus had landed a particularly vicious hit during training, and when I approached with a first aid kit I'd brought despite knowing he probably didn't need it, he didn't protest. Just sank onto the weight bench and let me clean the cuts on his knuckles with trembling hands that had nothing to do with fear of his injuries and everything to do with the intimacy of touching him without the barrier of professional distance between us. I need to tell you something, I whispered, my fingers gentle on his damaged skin, and his hand caught mine, stilling my movement as those dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. I know this is the worst possible timing. I know you're about to fight for your life, and probably the last thing you need is your secretary having an emotional breakdown, but I can't watch you prepare to face Caleb without you knowing that I've been in love with you for months, that every professional boundary I maintained was self-preservation because I knew if I let myself feel even a fraction of what I actually felt it would destroy me. Peter's expression shifted into something raw and vulnerable that I'd never seen before, his other hand cupping my face with that now familiar possessiveness, and when he spoke his voice was rough with emotion that seemed almost painful for him to express. I had a mate once, 70 years ago, when I was young and believed love made you stronger instead of weak, he said, and the confession felt like watching him tear open his chest to expose his heart. She was human, brilliant, and fierce, and I thought I could protect her from the violence of my world through sheer force of dominance. But I was challenged by a rival who knew exactly how to exploit my attachment, and I chose to meet him honorably instead of eliminating the threat preemptively because I believed my strength was enough. His jaw clenched, pain flickering across his features. I was wrong, and she paid the price for my arrogance when his pack targeted her while I was fighting, and I've spent 7 decades building walls high enough that I'd never make that mistake again. He pulled me closer, his forehead resting against mine. But then you walked into my office with your color-coded filing system and your ability to predict my needs and your completely inappropriate efficiency, and every wall I built started crumbling, and now Caleb threatened you, and I realized I'd burn down everything I've built, destroy every alliance I've made, slaughter anyone who stands between me and your safety. Because apparently some mistakes are worth repeating if the alternative is losing you. His voice dropped to an alpha command. Caleb will never touch you, never come close enough to breathe the same air, because I won't make the same mistake twice, won't let honor or rules or anything else stop me from protecting what's mine. The arena was an old amphitheater on the outskirts of the city that shifter clans had used for formal challenges since the 1800s, its stone walls bearing the scars of centuries of violence. And I stood in the observation box surrounded by Peter's most trusted enforcers, while below in the circular fighting pit Peter faced Caleb under the cold glare of industrial lights that had been rigged specifically for tonight's challenge. The crowd of shifters that lined the upper galleries represented every major clan in the region, all of them here to witness whether the Alpha King would maintain his dominance or whether Caleb's challenge would shatter the careful hierarchy Peter had spent decades establishing. And the air was thick with anticipation and the metallic scent of bloodlust that made my human instincts scream that I was surrounded by apex predators barely maintaining their civilized facades. Peter had stripped down to just dark pants that allowed for maximum movement, his muscled torso already marked with the ritual symbols that apparently signified a fight to the death, and even from this distance, I could see the crimson glow of his eyes, could see the way his body held that supernatural stillness that preceded explosive violence. Caleb circled him with that twitchy, unpredictable energy, already partially shifted with claws extended, and his face elongated into something between human and beast. And when the elder shifter officiating the challenge dropped his hand to signal the beginning, Caleb lunged with a speed that made him blur. Peter met the attack head-on, his own partial shift occurring mid-movement as claws erupted from his fingers and his body expanded with muscle that shouldn't have been able to exist on a human frame, and the sound of their collision was like a car crash, echoing off the stone walls as they came together in a tangle of violence that was too fast for my human eyes to fully track. I watched in horror as Caleb's claws raked across Peter's chest, opening 4 deep gouges that immediately began bleeding, but Peter used the momentum of the attack to spin inside Caleb's guard, his elbow connecting with the rival shaper's jaw with enough force that I heard bone crack from 50 feet away. They separated and circled, both breathing hard, and I realized with growing dread that Peter was holding back, was fighting with a controlled precision that spoke of strategy rather than the overwhelming dominance I'd witnessed during his training sessions, and it took me several exchanges of brutal blows to understand that he was maneuvering Caleb, was deliberately taking hits that he could have avoided in order to position the other shifter exactly where he wanted him. Peter's fighting style was a devastating combination of martial arts technique and raw shifter strength, his movements fluid and purposeful even as blood ran down his torso from multiple wounds, even as Caleb landed a vicious kick to his ribs that would have killed a normal human instantly. But Peter's eyes never stopped blazing that fierce crimson, never showed even a flicker of doubt or fear, and every time Caleb thought he had an advantage, Peter would counter with a strike so precisely placed that it became clear the Alpha King was dismantling his opponent piece by piece, breaking him down both physically and psychologically with a kind of patient, methodical violence that spoke of centuries of experience in combat. Caleb lunged again, his jaws extending into a full muzzle as he aimed for Peter's throat, and Peter caught him mid-leap, his hands closing around Caleb's windpipe with crushing force as he used the rival shaper's own momentum to slam him into the stone floor hard enough that the entire amphitheater shook with the impact. And I knew we were approaching the moment where Peter's control would finally give way to the full fury of his alpha nature. Marcus appeared at my elbow in the observation box, his face grim as he pressed his phone into my hand with the intercepted message displayed on the screen, and my blood turned to ice as I read Caleb's instructions to his pack sent just hours before the challenge. Orders to eliminate Emma regardless of the fight's outcome, to make sure Peter understood that challenging Caleb had consequences that extended beyond the arena. The realization hit me like a physical blow that this had never been about corporate secrets or territorial disputes, that Caleb had orchestrated everything specifically to destroy Peter by destroying everyone he cared about, and my eyes snapped back to the fighting pit just as Caleb managed to sink his claws deep into Peter's shoulder, twisting viciously as Peter's control finally wavered, and a roar of pain tore from his throat that made every shifter in the amphitheater respond with instinctive submission to their Alpha King's rage. But in that moment of Peter's distraction, I saw movement in the shadows behind him, saw one of Caleb's enforcers raise a modified tranquilizer rifle loaded with what I immediately recognized as wolfsbane darts that could paralyze even an alpha for crucial seconds, and something inside me that had been carefully controlled and professionally contained for my entire life suddenly snapped like a wire pulled too tight. I grabbed the concealed Glock from Marcus's shoulder holster with hands that were suddenly perfectly steady despite never having fired a weapon in my life, my body moving on instincts I didn't know I possessed as I vaulted over the observation box railing and dropped the 15 feet to the arena floor, landing in a crouch that should have shattered my ankles, but instead felt natural and right. And I fired 3 shots in rapid succession that caught Caleb's accomplice center mass before he could pull his trigger, my aim impossibly perfect as the threat crumpled to the ground. The entire amphitheater went silent except for the sound of my breathing and the metallic click of my gun still trained on the fallen shifter, and I felt every predatory eye in the building focus on me with new assessment, with the realization that the fragile human secretary had just killed one of their kind with a precision that spoke of something more than luck or desperation. Peter's head whipped around to stare at me, blood streaming from his wounds, his expression shifting from shock to something fierce and possessive and absolutely feral as he understood what I'd done, that I'd thrown myself into danger to protect him the same way he'd been willing to destroy his empire to protect me. The moment of distraction cost Caleb everything, because Peter's rage at seeing me in the arena, at realizing I'd been forced to violence because of this threat, unleashed something in him that went beyond alpha authority into pure primal dominance. He moved with a speed that defied physics, his hand closing around Caleb's throat as his other arm drew back with claws fully extended, and the strike that followed was so brutally efficient that Caleb's body went limp before it even hit the ground, his neck torn open in a spray of blood that painted the arena floor crimson. Peter stood over the fallen shaper, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing so bright they cast red light across the stone walls, and when he roared his victory it was a sound of such absolute authority that every shifter in the amphitheater dropped to one knee in automatic submission, acknowledging without question that their Alpha King had not only defended his territory, but had found a mate fierce enough to fight beside him. Marcus's voice crackled through the earpiece he'd pressed into my hand before I'd vaulted into the arena, confirming that Emma was secure and that Caleb's remaining pack members had been neutralized by Peter's enforcers the moment their alpha fell, the carefully coordinated operation ensuring that every thread of the threat had been severed simultaneously. Peter crossed the blood-stained arena floor toward me, with that predatory grace that no longer triggered my fear response, but instead sent heat racing through my veins. And when he reached me, his hands cupped my face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone still covered in his enemy's blood. His crimson eyes finally fading back to dark brown as he studied my expression with an intensity that felt like he was memorizing every detail of this moment. "You protected me," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion that I'd only heard once before when he'd confessed about his lost mate. Except now there was wonder mixed with a pain. Disbelief that someone would throw themselves into danger for him when he'd spent 70 years convinced that attachment only created vulnerabilities to exploit. "You saw me wounded, and your first instinct wasn't to run or hide behind my enforcers. It was to grab a weapon you'd never fired and kill a shifter twice your size because the idea of me being hurt was more terrifying than your own death." His thumb brushed across my cheekbone, and I realized I was crying again. Except this time the tears were relief and overwhelming love rather than fear. "That's why you don't belong behind a desk organizing my schedule anymore, Olivia. That's why you belong at my side, running this empire with me as my partner, my mate, the one person in this world I trust with both my life and my heart." 6 months later, I stood in Peter's office wearing a tailored suit that cost more than my entire previous wardrobe combined, my new title of Chief Operating Officer, and mate to the Alpha King printed on business cards that I rarely needed because every shifter clan and corporate entity within 1,000 miles knew exactly who I was and what I represented. The company had just closed a merger that would expand Peter's influence into 3 new territories, negotiations I'd led personally with a confidence that still sometimes surprised me. The shy secretary who used to hide her tears in closets transformed into someone who could stare down rival alphas and corporate raiders with equal composure. Secure in the knowledge that I had the most powerful shifter in North America at my back and in my bed, Peter emerged from his private conference room where he'd been coordinating security protocols with his enforcement network, and the smile that crossed his face when he saw me was softer than anything he showed the rest of the world. An expression reserved exclusively for private moments when the Alpha King could let his guard down enough to be simply Peter, the man who'd found me crying among his expensive coats and decided that protecting me was worth risking everything he'd built. He pulled me close against his chest, his arms wrapping around me with that possessive certainty that had become as familiar as breathing, and I felt him press a kiss to the top of my head. "Who would have thought," I murmured against his shirt, "that having a breakdown in your closet would lead to this, to running a supernatural empire and being mated to a shifter who once told me my efficiency was inappropriately perfect." He laughed, the sound vibrating through his chest into mine. "You gave me something I spent 7 decades convinced I'd never have again, something more dangerous and valuable than any corporate asset or territorial alliance," he said, tilting my face up so I could see the fierce love burning in his eyes that no longer needed to glow crimson to show his intensity. "You gave me a heart worth protecting, and in return I'll spend the rest of my very long life making sure nothing ever makes you cry in closets again."